In the days leading up to Easter, the Bible lays out for us the accounts of Jesus' actions on this week-long process leading up to his crucifixion and then his resurrection. On the Sunday before Easter, we have what is most commonly known as Palm Sunday. And the Gospel of Luke, as I'd like to take us to now, gives us a unique perspective into some insights in the story of Jesus and his disciples. The story of the Gospel really is about Jesus. He is the central character, but it can often be very difficult to relate to because Jesus is the personification of perfection. He's the Savior of the world, and we are those in need of a Savior. So speckled into these stories is the picture of the disciples and their struggle to understand what it truly means to be a disciple, to follow Christ and all of those things entailed, and also to see Jesus in his teaching and understand the significance of what he is claiming to be the Messiah. We see here in Luke chapter 19, starting in verse 28, the story of Palm Sunday as Jesus is entering into the city in this triumphal entrance. He tells his disciples to go ahead of him and to make arrangements for him to ride on a colt, a message of peace demonstrating who he was as the Savior of the world. Now, this is following a series of events for the disciples. They have just spent a week-long ministry with Jesus after Jesus has raised their friend Lazarus from the dead. This has increased their following dramatically and intensified the amount of worship that Jesus was receiving. So as Jesus is riding on this colt into the city, he is being thronged with hundreds and thousands of followers and supporters singing his praises. They're saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest." The disciples must have felt really excited and maybe even bore some of that praise for themselves, having been with Jesus, serving alongside of him for 3 years. This was the highlight of their experience. But it's in this same moment that the Pharisees, the religious leaders of that day, really addressed Jesus. They confronted him. They rebuke him by saying, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples," because his disciples were worshiping him. Jesus' response is pretty interesting. He says, "I tell you, if these were silent, the very stones would cry out." Now, Jesus is referring to the stones of the temple. These were very special stones, created at the beginning of creation. They were there to see and watch the birds of the air being created, the fish of the sea, all of the mammals of the world being created, and God creating mankind. They were there when Jesus rested on the seventh day, and being so significantly placed, these stones were selected to be the place of the building in which God rested. Here they are used to form the temple of God, a place of worship, and Jesus recognizes their glory. As he's coming into the city, he tells the Pharisees that if his disciples weren't worshiping him and praising him, that these very stones would cry out. But in this very next breath, Jesus walks up to the city, and seeing it in his view, he starts to cry. He starts to weep over the fact that they were really going to miss the significance of who Jesus was, but also realizing the devastation that is in front of them. The city will be destroyed. He's already predicted its destruction, and the stones that were used to make up the temple will be cast down. Here is a remarkable picture, really a picture of the disciples and a picture of you and me, and the significance of understanding our place in the process of knowing what it truly means to be a disciple and following Jesus. We find ourselves going through these mixed emotions, this idea of worshiping God and being a part of something that is amazing, worshiping God on Sunday and knowing that we are surrounded by brothers and sisters that will lift us up and encourage us. But we also know that there is something about to take place during this week as we reflect upon the death of Christ, the destruction of his life, because we all deserve to die. We deserved that destruction. And so we are given these two contrasting ideas. The disciples couldn't quite understand. They couldn't wrap their minds around. And sometimes it's difficult for us as well. As we meditate on the triumphal entry, as Jesus is entering into the city of Jerusalem, we must also reflect upon the challenges that we face as we understand that not all of the time are we happy and worshiping and being joined in the exaltation and praise. Sometimes there are challenges, and we must remember that in those circumstances, Christ is with us, and He has gone before us, and He weeps over the destruction that we might face. But He also encourages us by the power that He has as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. So over the course of this week, I want to invite you to join with us in reading through the narrative of the Gospel of Luke, starting in chapter 19, and all throughout these days, we'll understand and discover what Jesus is doing as He's walking towards the cross and inviting us as His disciples to come after Him, to take up our cross daily, and to follow Him.